Hello.
Welcome. We'll get started in a few minutes, so letting people join. Glad to have everyone here with us today on this Friday.
Yes.
Maybe I can start with the housekeeping stuff as people filter in. Do you think that's okay? Okay, cool. All right. Well, welcome to today's NTAC session entitled Minds Matter, Strategies for Supporting Students with Mental Health Challenges in School. This is a multi-part learning series specifically for educators. We're so happy that you all are taking time out of your busy day to join us today. Before we get started, we do have some housekeeping items to go over with you. But we would love to learn more about you in the chat box. If you could take a minute to enter your organization, your role, and where you're located, so we can get a sense of who's here with us. As part of our session, we must provide you with this disclaimer. This presentation was prepared by NTAC under a cooperative agreement from SAMHSA. While this event is supported by SAMHSA, the contents are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of SAMHSA, HHS, or the US government. While we hope that there are not any security issues that happen today, in the event that any may occur, this session will immediately end and you'll be notified by email how to rejoin the session. Thank you again for attending one of our NTAC sessions. Listed here are all of our incredible national partners that have come together to utilize their expertise and their subject matter knowledge to help inform the field by creating products, resources, and sessions like this one to enhance the behavioral and mental health fields. As a center, our vision is that all children, youth, and families living with and impacted by mental health challenges will have access to the resources and opportunities they need to thrive in a comprehensive and equitable system of care. We serve a wide cross-sector audience, including everyone from state leaders to providers, to school workforce, infant and early childhood providers, community-based partners, peer supervisors, family partners, youth partners, and much more. Our services range from individual consultation to more in-depth sessions, like the ones we're offering you today, to peer learning exchanges and tools to help you. Our aim is to really create those outlets for communication, collaboration, and resource sharing amongst all of us. Please also make sure to check out all of our resources and archived presentations on our website, or go to the Contact Us link there to request consultation or training. And you can visit our website. I'll put it in the chat box. Okay. Before we get started, we want to address some commonly asked questions that come up during our sessions to let you know before we get started some answers to those questions. In the follow-up email for today's session, you will receive a certificate of completion, a link to the recording of the session, and a copy of the slide deck presented that's being shown. You should have also received a copy of the slide deck in the reminder email that was sent earlier today or yesterday if you would like to access it for today's session. Okay. Now that we've made it through the housekeeping items, we want to welcome you again to our session today. And today is our part one of this multi-part series where we will be focusing on depression and anxiety. Before we get to content, we're going to introduce our team for today. I guess I can start since I'm already talking. I'm Dr. Olivia Hamra. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist with Georgetown University Medical Center. I am from the Washington, D.C. area. And actually, before I went to medical school and became a psychiatrist, I was a teacher in a DC public charter school, teaching middle school physics and also remedial math. And since have developed a passion for mental health and well-being in children and adolescents, which has brought me here today. And I will pass it off to Ms. Brooks Porter.
Hello, everyone. I am super excited to be here with you all today. I am Ariel Brooks Porter. I am the Director of Student Services at Ingenuity Prep, a public charter school in Washington, D.C. I started my journey in education as a seventh grade English language arts teacher as a core member for Teach for America and have matriculated through supporting students in self-contained spaces, students in a general ed space. I've supported as a special education teacher, special education vice principal, and now primarily as a director and consultant. So I'm excited to meet and chat with you guys today.
Awesome. And then Karina, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dr. Hamra. My name is Karina Joyner, and I am a licensed social worker. I work as a research associate with the organization CARS on the project Intact. And today I am mostly doing background work, taking notes to capture that we will send out once the entire series completes.
Thanks. And then we don't have Melissa with us here today, unfortunately. But I will, Bridget, do you want to introduce yourself too? Just so we get everyone.
No, thank you. I'm just tech support. If you need me, I'm here.
Okay, Bridget's here for tech support. Thank you so much. All right. What our session today is going to look like. We did our introductions and I see people are putting their role and where they're coming from in the chat, which is awesome. Thank you so much for everyone who's done that so far. We're going to do a quick mood check-in and then we'll present some content on managing depression and anxiety in school. And then what we'll do is we'll close out of the PowerPoint, have people turn on their cameras and talk about cases that we're seeing, answer questions and discuss real world scenarios so that we can all learn from each other. And then we'll check out. Okay. So I know you all are putting in the chat where you're located. If you also would like, you can add what you hope to learn from the session today, so we can get an idea of goals. I see there's people here from Virginia and Maryland, New York.
We have Nebraska.
Oh, Nebraska, Florida, nice. California. It's morning in California. Cool. Yeah, definitely keep adding your information to the chat. And then the other thing that we can enter into the chat is how we're feeling today. So just to do a quick check-in on where we're all at, you can pick an emoji that you feel represents your mood today and type that in the chat too. I'm gonna add my emoji. Cool. People are feeling pretty today. Oh no.
Oh, Eric. Well, I hope this session makes you feel a little better.
Well, keep adding your emojis. It's good to kind of take a minute to check in on how you're doing.
Oh, North Carolina.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about depression and anxiety. And this session's going to be maybe a little longer in terms of content, like didactic content, just because we kind of smushed together two things, depression and anxiety. So that's why I'll kind of get started quicker. I want to start just by saying anxiety and depression and the symptoms of these disorders start early on, particularly anxiety. As you can see here, even as early as between the ages of 3 and 5, we'll start to see some signs of anxiety. A lot of times it'll look like behavior disorders. And then as kids get older, we see more depression, anxiety, and other behavior disorders. And so it's really important to keep an eye out for these things, even in the young kids, because there's a lot we can do early on to intervene and to help kids manage their symptoms. Just some data in 2021 and 2022, 10% of children between the ages of 3 and 17 had current diagnosed anxiety, a little bit more prevalent in females compared to males. 4% of children between the ages of 3 and 17 had current diagnosed depression. And again, more prevalent in girls. Among adolescents, mental health has been a huge concern. Some updated data here is that 21% of adolescents between the ages of 12 and 17 reported symptoms of anxiety in the past 2 weeks. 17% reported symptoms of depression in the past 2 weeks. And among US high school students in 2023, 40% reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness in the past year. That's a huge number. 20% had seriously considered attempting suicide. 16% reported making a suicide plan in the past year, and 9% reported attempting suicide. So scary in terms of how common this actually is in the kids that we're seeing in schools, and just shows how important it is to screen for these symptoms and to address them to make sure we're keeping our kids safe and well. So what is depression? I'm gonna go into the diagnostic criteria. As a psychiatrist, as a doctor, we use the DSM-5 to diagnose major depressive disorder. And specifically, the criteria to diagnose major depressive disorder would be that over at least 2 weeks, a lot of times it's longer, you would need to see 5 out of these 9 symptoms, and one of them has to be either persistent low mood or anhedonia. And anhedonia is like a lack of ability to get pleasure from typically pleasurable activities. So like, for example, in a child, that would be like if the kid typically really loves hanging out with friends or playing a sport, they just don't find that pleasure from that activity anymore, things like that. And then the other symptoms that we'll see, the acronym that we'll use is SIGI CAPS. That's kind of how you remember it. Changes in sleep, so either having trouble sleeping, like insomnia, or sleeping too much. Decreased interest, feelings of guilt, decreased energy, trouble with concentration, changes in appetite, and again, that could be either decreased appetite or increased appetite and overeating. Psychomotor slowing, so like moving more slowly than usual, or agitation, like feeling restless and fidgety. And then the last one is suicidal thoughts. So again, if you have 5 out of these 9 symptoms over at least 2 weeks, you can be diagnosed with a major depressive episode.
And so when we think about depression, I want to jump in to discuss what this might look like in the classroom. It could look like lack of focus, because the student is often spacing out, somatic complaints. You have kids who, I have a headache, my stomach hurts, and they always want to go to the nurse. Change in work completion. So they were probably doing it consistently and then started dropping off to not completing work all the way or to not turning it in at all. Again, that fatigue, so tiredness in the classroom, always falling asleep. When that's a sudden change, it's a trigger because it should push you to think that there's something else possibly impacting the student's ability to be attentive in the space. Sensitivity to feedback, not eating at lunch because they're not hungry, so loss of appetite, consistent mood swings and crying, inability to engage in lighthearted conversation just because their mood is taking over their ability to be present in that time and easily triggered. And so a lot of these things show up in the classroom environment, and when it comes as a 180 change, it's an alarm for us to be able to do something about it. So how might you respond? Some of those things is just to provide space and grace for students to be able to feel their emotions, but to be able to be vulnerable with you about what those emotions might be. Notifying the family to see if there have been any changes at home that could be impacting the student's current ability to show up how they would on a typical day. Notifying the school or counseling team to conduct a check-in. This could also be providing a tier 1 intervention, such as a check-in, check-out protocol, just to be able to check on the student's mood and progress monitor what things help them to feel good, help lift their spirits, and what things also trigger that continued sadness. It could be, if it continues to persist over long periods of time, referral for treatment and more supports, those classroom interventions again. You may identify a safe person, a safe space, and then provide preference or choice-based learning opportunities to increase student engagement. So sometimes now I'm writing and I'm triggered, but I've noticed as an educator that sometimes writing might not work, but in this age of technology and all the support that we have, maybe typing can help you write your 5-paragraph essay, right? So being able to remember what the end goal is for the task, but provide differentiated opportunities for the student to meet that expectation. Oh, we
Olivia,
can.
you muted.
Sorry. And thinking about identifying symptoms of depression, and then also just being able to track symptoms over time. There are some good validated depression screening scales for young kids. The PHQ-9 is really commonly used. It's a great screener, validated for 12 years and older. And then for the younger kids, the CESDC and the CAD-6 can be useful screening tools. And then the CDS has a parent and child form, so you can get information from the parent as well. So these are good screening tools to not only screen for and identify symptoms of depression, but then also track those symptoms over time. Getting into anxiety disorders, there are a lot of them, and I kind of listed all of the ones out here in the, again, going back to the DSM-5, the defined anxiety disorders would be separation anxiety, social anxiety, generalized anxiety. I kind of look at these as almost like progressive developmentally, where a lot of times you'll see like separation anxiety in the young kids. And if that's not addressed, or if you have like a really anxious kid, that can kind of like morph into social anxiety as they get older, and then that can kind of morph into generalized anxiety as you go into like transition to adulthood. There's also panic disorder, so that would be like a disorder of experiencing panic attacks and then fear of having panic attacks, and avoidance of those situations that you feel might bring on panic. Selective mutism we can see in younger kids. That's like not speaking in very specific settings. Specific phobia is a phobia of just like one very specific thing. And then obsessive compulsive disorder and adjustment disorder don't actually fall under the anxiety disorders category, but a lot of times we do think of them as very much relating to anxiety. Obsessive compulsive disorder is kind of like on the extreme end of that. And we'll address it in a very similar way as we would address other anxiety disorders. An adjustment disorder is a lot of times looks like anxiety, and it's just, we know that it's in response to a very specific stressor. Screening scales for anxiety disorders. The GAD-7 is a great screening scale for generalized anxiety, again, validated for 12 years and older. The SCARED is a really nice one because it goes through multiple anxiety disorders. It screens for generalized anxiety, social anxiety, school avoidance, separation anxiety. And so that can be really useful in terms of categorizing symptoms and then also, again, tracking them over time. There's also a child and a parent version, which is nice, and validated for a little younger, at like 8 to 18. And then there's also a brief version of the SCARED that screens for anxiety and also trauma-related symptoms.
So some of the things you might see in the class for anxiety is avoidance, the avoidance of the things that kind of trigger that anxiety. So similar when we're thinking about like that generalized or that specific anxiety, if I'm a student who has a hard time writing, I've got bad grades in writing my whole academic experience. When writing comes, I'm probably going to avoid this thing because I'm anxious that what I've always experienced will continue to experience. Lack of focus, inability to focus on certain things, somatic complaints again, so that head and stomach ache, especially when those non-preferred tasks start to come up, right? Oh, it's time to write. My head hurts. I gotta put my head down. Math, I agree with you, Bridget. Math was always my thing. So when math came, I definitely had a stomach ache and needed to go to the nurse. Change in work completion, inability to do things individually. That's one thing that I want to point out. Sometimes it's easy to not be able to do it. It's easy to opt out when you have to do it individually, but when you have a group setting or are working closely with the teacher, you're more inclined to do that work. I experience that a lot with students. Panic and or explosiveness. Every small thing pushes you to panic, especially when you're getting feedback and it's so much to take in at the time, pushing you for panic. And then some spaces where you're crying and sad, trouble testing because that anxiety starts to take over your thought process and your ability to recount what you learned in the classroom. So you may experience a lot of students when it comes to standardized testing, the high expectations that come along with it, the need to have to earn a 4 or better, or write well, or do all of the things that we discuss in those last few months of the school year. Trouble testing starts to come in when those standardized assessments hits. And then also elopement as a trigger. When it gets unbearable, you may start to see students eloping more toward those non-preferred tasks. And so I just wanted to point some of those things out and also just discuss what are some things that we could do, how could we respond when these things begin to happen. And so first, I want to start with one of the things we may do to respond is intervene before the symptoms reach disorder level. And so as teachers, as educators, as people who work in schools, it's important for us to be able to recognize the signs. So as we start to see some of that work avoidance, the same student keeps coming to you every day at the same time, right? Like we start to see these symptoms intervening at that time. So if a student is always coming to you at 12:26 because they want to skip English class that starts at 12:30, maybe you'll start meeting them in their class at 12:30, right? And giving them the support they need in the classroom environment so that they know that they cannot skip that time of the day. Destigmatizing the experience of anxiety. A lot of times, especially in school, students can be a bit private about how they're feeling because they don't want to be judged about having anxiety. But letting students know that it's super common, that you may experience it, that multiple people experience it, and that it is okay. one thing that is super helpful and beneficial for kids is always providing them with real world experiences that you have, but also being able to show them what you've done to help you work through it. And so if I'm experiencing anxiety, I might share with the specific student, like, I just experienced some anxiety a little earlier because I had to do this thing. And to help my mind prepare, getting ready for a speaking event, a test, a meeting with my boss, I took some deep breaths. I turned the light off. I took a walk. I got some water. Really including students in that process of how you manage your anxiety can help provide them models of what they could do when they start to feel those triggers for themselves. Validate the discomfort and really just give them some reassurance around having some um, interventions that will assist them to self-regulate and have some self-control in their classroom environments. If there are any parental anxiety needs or needs for treatment, it's important to identify those. So if you notice a student is consistently having possible panic attacks or exhibiting symptoms of anxiety, contact their parents. See if that is valid at the home. Sometimes our parents exhibit a lot of anxiety and it's seemingly genetic because now I'm exhibiting that same anxiety because that's a learned thing, right? So like try to connect with the parents because they could possibly use some support and do some of that modeling that's necessary for kids to learn how to self-regulate. And then lastly, teach some of those replacement behaviors, ones that the student identifies with so that they could use it more consistently on their own when they recognize those behaviors. A couple other things that I just want to share is that when it comes to managing anxiety, managing a lot of things, in schools, we have a lot of students who are neurodivergent, who have different disabilities. One thing that is consistent and key is having a strong routine in your classroom, in your school for transitions, arrival, dismissal. So students can have a sense of predictability. They already know what they're coming into, but then also being planned enough so that if things change and when they do, because they will, you can communicate that with kids. And so that way they can have an opportunity to show their flexibility, to learn how to navigate those things that are not the norm. Treat children as capable rather than fragile. Avoid the overprotection because that becomes a crutch that is relied upon. And we want to continue to teach students independence as they grow, matriculate. And so instead of the fragile and overprotection, we want to push them to be brave and try new things even when they're hard, because that'll allow them to be strong, successful individuals, and as they matriculate, able to regulate their own emotions. Set reasonable goals that include student ownership. Student ownership is super important. As educators, we often create goals that students have to meet, but how can I meet a goal that I don't even know that I have, right? Include the student and allow them to have some ownership in those goals so that they can feel a sense of self-success, right? A sense of winning and championing their own things, but also an opportunity for them to hold themselves accountable to meeting said goal. And then lastly, introduce one new thing at a time. I don't know about you guys, but it's super hard for me when somebody comes and gives me 16 things at a time. I don't know the 15th, 14th, 13th, or 12th thing that you just shared with me, but I can work on the first one, right? So when we're supporting students, we want to make sure that we are introducing one thing at a time, make sure we support them enough to where they're comfortable doing it individually and comfortable mastering it before we move on to the next thing.
Yeah, and I'll add in here this graph that I added in. This is the whole theory behind treatment, behavioral treatment for anxiety, is the idea of habituation. So essentially what we see in an anxiety disorder is our brain is assessing that something is threatening, when really there's no actual threat, there's no real danger. So what we want to do is we want to teach our brains that whatever that thing is that's making us feel anxious is not actually something we need to fear. And the way that we do that is through this concept of exposure and response prevention, to slowly expose ourselves to that thing that feels threatening, and to teach ourselves that it's actually nothing that we need to be fearing. And we see the evidence shows us that as we do that over time, not only does our response to that perceived threat decrease, but the time that it takes to decrease reduces, and our baseline anxiety reduces as well. So this is like the evidence-based treatment for anxiety, and we can do this in school, right? Just through natural exposures. And like Ariel is talking about, like just introducing small things one at a time and not accommodating that avoidance behavior that the student may have, but really pushing them and believing them and saying, like, I know you can handle this. Yeah.
Some other ways that we could respond are some relaxation techniques, deep breathing. I shared that a little bit ago. Progressive muscle relaxation, what that looks like, meditation, guided imagery. If you're in the classroom, this could look like having a calm down corner. You're including different fidgets and tools that help students to maintain ownership and control of that anxiety, right? Changing behaviors in response to anxiety. So identify a coach or a brave partner for the student, notifying that school counselors to provide some of that tier 1 support, providing some points and incentive systems to expose students to wins when they're able to control their own anxiety, right? So instead of eloping, you took some deep breaths in the calm down corner. I'm going to give you a star every time you do that. And every time you get 5 stars, you're going to get X incentive, to really push student ownership and making those change behaviors a reality. Cope ahead. So being able to coach the student to say, hey, things are going to change in the next 30 minutes. We just found out that we're going to have an emergency fire drill. I know this is going to break our norm for our classroom. So what are some things that we could do when that happens? What do you need right now to prepare for that in 30 minutes, right? Coping ahead does require for us to also be ahead, to know what's coming up, to know how things may impact the kids in our classrooms. But when we can let our students know ahead of time, we could allow them the opportunity to prepare, to cope ahead, and to actually navigate those changes in strong ways. And then lastly, identify thoughts around anxiety, and then check the facts, right? A lot of anxiety thoughts and things that we think about are from stereotypes. We hear from stereotypes, we hear about anxiety happening in certain ways, what that may mean about you. Check the facts, and check the facts with students. That allows them to build their critical thinking skills. It allows them to always go back to the drawing board to look at the research, but then also it validates who they are as people and lets them know that what they're experiencing is not a one-off thing, but that most of us do experience it and that they're not alone.
I'll go back to this a little. The first line treatment for an anxiety disorder, specifically mild and moderate anxiety, and same goes with depression, mild and moderate depression in kids, would be behavioral therapy. Specifically, cognitive behavioral therapy is the treatment that has the highest level of evidence. And these are the things that cognitive behavioral therapy teaches. So referral to a therapist is ideal. That access isn't always immediately available to kids. So we have to recognize that, but also know that like these are things that we can implement just like as professionals in general. And like teaching us how to calm our bodies, working towards exposure, that's already getting started, those steps that a child would be exposed to in cognitive behavioral therapy too. And that would be the gold standard. And then in the case that, let's say, a student is in cognitive behavioral therapy and we are not seeing a response, like over maybe 6 months to a year, we would want to introduce a medication. Or if we're at that level of like moderate to severe anxiety or depression, that's when we would also want to consider a medication. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or fluoxetine, escitalopram, sertraline. You might have heard them as Prozac, Lexapro, and Zoloft. are the most common and first-line medications for treatment of anxiety and depression in children. Most of them are approved for 6 and older. So that's generally when we would want to think about medication. Any younger, we're really going to focus on the behavioral interventions. It's most effective, these medications are most effective when they're paired with regular therapy. So again, that combination is really the most effective. These medications are interesting in that they have to be taken consistently. And taking them consistently, we usually don't see the full effect of that dose of the medication until like 6 to 8 weeks into taking it. So there is that lag time. And that can be important, like as a doctor, to partner with the school and to help them understand that, like, even though I'm starting a medication now, we might not really see a huge difference for a while. And we also want to keep an eye out for side effects too. The most common are GI upset, like nausea, diarrhea. We can usually avoid that by starting with low doses and slowly increasing the dose. And that usually, if the child does experience it, it goes away after a few days to a week. Sleep disturbance, waking up more overnight. And then headache can also be another common side effect. Again, all of these side effects are things that usually go away after taking the medication more consistently. But just things to keep an eye out for. They're very safe medications. There aren't really significant long-term risks with taking them, but some rare but serious side effects to know. There is an FDA black box warning for increased suicidality with starting these medications in children, so not for adults, but younger than 24. This was based on a study that was done on identifying like suicidal thoughts and behaviors. There's not actually an increased risk of suicide. And it was a small increase. I think it was like 1% in placebo, 2% in the intervention group. And actually in studies after that, the results were not replicated. But because it's so serious, we want to inform students and their families that this is a potential risk, and we just monitor really closely. And then for a child who maybe is at risk for mania, like bipolar disorder, these medications can trigger the onset of mania. So again, something that we would it wouldn't preclude us from using this medication. Like, let's say if they have a parent with bipolar disorder, but again, we would just want to be a lot more careful in terms of monitoring.
And one thing that I would just point out is that it's this 6 to 8 weeks for full effect. Being super important to note is that, especially if this is a student in a school setting, because as teachers, educators, and school staff, it's easy to assume that because a student has begun a medication, that behaviors are supposed to change very quickly. We know a RTI cycle is 6 weeks. So it can be like, well, it's been 6 weeks and nothing has happened or nothing has changed yet, right? But being able to like preface what this looks like in the school setting, if you're the school psychologist or the social worker, and you know that this is how long it takes for this medicine to take into effect, being able to proactively communicate that with the teachers so that they understand what that journey is going to look like for the students, so that they could also have realistic expectations.
The other thing I'll say, I don't know why I don't have this here because it's really important, is for the older kids, like high school kids, another really common side effect is sexual side effects. And I always bring that up because a lot of times kids will be like embarrassed to say if something changes in terms of like sexual desire, ability to reach orgasm, those kinds of things. So we want them to be able to communicate with us. That's one of the side effects that a lot of times doesn't go away. So we want them to tell us, and we want to make changes if it's really bothering them, so they're not just like stopping the medication without talking to their doctor first about it. So that's just something else that's important to note. Okay. I'm going to stop screen sharing for now. I feel like we presented a lot of material, and I would love for people to turn on their cameras to think about kids who you all come into contact with, and if there's any students in particular who come to mind who you feel would be useful to discuss, I would love to open it up to have someone present that student. We can kind of talk about a case. Or ask any questions that have come up.
If there are any students that you're interested in troubleshooting, this is a great space to do so, just because there are so many strong people in this space who have similar experiences. It'll be nice to hear what some of you are trying at your schools and in your spaces, to support students who may have depression and or anxiety. Yes, and if you share, please remember to de-identify. So no student names at all.
So I may have missed some of the comments that you guys were making about medication. Some of what I heard regarding Prozac, is that one of the most effective types of medication that you guys have experienced or have had results with?
Yeah, yes. So Prozac is an SSRI. It is first line treatment for depression and anxiety disorders in kids that have moderate to severe depression and anxiety. So yes, Prozac. Were there questions that you had about that?
Not currently. I had a youth that was taking Prozac. I've since then finished his case, but he continued on that medication. What are the long-lasting effects, some of the effects side effects that he may have to deal with ongoing?
So usually if people are tolerating those medications when they start them, there's not really any like long-term down the road side effects. They're really safe, honestly. In general, particularly for anxiety, we start the medications with the idea that we're gonna try to come off of the medication at some point. Like we generally don't necessarily want, like, especially for like a young child, to be on that medication forever. As they're going through therapy, as they're learning skills to cope with stress and to manage their anxiety, they're kind of increasing their ability to do that, and we can slowly come off the medication and generally can do quite well with that. Like we said in the beginning of the presentation, the treatment for anxiety disorders has a lot of really strong evidence, and it's very, very effective. Depression is a little bit different. Once a person has a major depressive episode, the risk of having another one goes up to like about 50%. And once somebody has two major depressive episodes, the risk goes up to more like 90%. So it gets like really high. So if someone has recurrent depression, then what we would say is we probably would want you to be taking that medication for your whole life, unless you like really want to be coming off of it. We would do that in very close contact with a doctor, with monitoring of symptoms, tapering off very slowly, just to avoid any recurrence of symptoms. So a little different when you're comparing depression and anxiety and considering those longer term treatment options with medications. But yeah, that's really usually when we want to think about coming off is when the child, or even if they're an adult now, we want them to be stable. So like remission of symptoms for at least 6 months. I like to wait a year. And then we talk about coming off the medication.
Thank you.
Mhm. What other questions or cases are coming up for people? One thing that I think is a huge issue with anxiety, and even depression too, is school avoidance.
Mm.
How do people usually manage that in your settings?
School avoidance is a big one because I recognize that it happens a lot in the later grades, whether it be like 8th grade, I've seen it happening a bit, but then more prevalent in high school. And depending on when it happens, if a student doesn't have a strong person at school who knows them, who knows their history, who knows their family, I think it is often seen as like, well, truancy. I'm gonna call home. You're not coming. You stop coming. Your family doesn't know what to do anymore. It's easily seen as a truancy issue, especially if, sometimes families don't know why they're not coming to school. They're unable to like communicate what's actually going on with the student because they were unable to recognize those symptoms as well. And so it's just seen again as that disrespect, the misbehavior, and the inability to do what's expected of them when there is an underlying issue.
If I could share, this definitely does kind of hit home. I'm a district level position for K through 12 public schools, and we definitely see both of those things. That there's a lot of correlation between anxiety and what is identified as truancy, and I think that folks have made some efforts to try to address that discrepancy. I'm not sure that what's happening is all that helpful though, because what we've been seeing a lot of is home and hospital requests that just kind of end up being ongoing. And a child is then, the truancy conversation happens with the family, then they consult with the providers or they go get a provider that then makes that recommendation. And it's my understanding that it's supposed to be more intentional as to what the prognosis is, what the plan is for the child to be able to return and, within that 3-month or less period. But what I feel has been happening is there's just kind of a repetitive application that takes place. And my concern is how that child is being able to learn to cope, be able to reintegrate, be able to feel success. So I don't know what the answer, or if that's even really a question, but that's a concern. And I'm not sure if others are seeing it and if there are any recommendations. We don't want to just, deny every request, but it's been really difficult because providers, a lot of the psychs are just making the recommendation over and over, and we feel kind of stuck.
That's something, Kara, I'm glad you brought up that I'm still trying to also figure out, because I recognize that there is a gap between what parents know, what families know, and then the school, right? And that gap is in how we're supporting their students or how they should support their students at home. So similar to like, what does that reintegration look like? One of the things I've toyed with is like, when it gets to that point of truancy or home and health, do we require a re-entry class then for the family, right? Like maybe we're discussing what that might look like then afterwards, because now if you're doing home and health, then possibly your school requires a like, take this course or come a couple days so that we could discuss this, practice these skills so that you could start it with your student. Maybe if it's a 30-day process or a 2-month process, that expectation starting within that second month so that it's supporting the reintegration for said student, because then it provides some sense of accountability for the family and then for the student, with hopes that they do reintegrate instead of committing to that cycle.
Yeah, I agree. And with school avoidance, that the sense of relief and reward that comes with not going to school is so powerful for that student. Like going back to that graph of like learning behaviors, that like it's so like they need to avoid at school. And they're learning that that's the only way that they can feel safe. And so as soon as possible, we want those kids to be in school. Like it's like urgent. As soon as there's an issue with school avoidance, we want that kid back in school as soon as possible. And the longer they're out of school, the more difficult it's going to be to get back. Because they're just reinforcing that, like, I'm safe, I'm out of school, and it's the only way that I can be safe. And so, yeah, like the home and hospital programs, I agree. Like when that comes up as an option, and we know that it's anxiety and it's school avoidance, we want to, if it has to be done, it has to be in as short a period as possible. And we really want kids to be in school, even if it's for, initially 15 minutes in the morning, and then slowly increasing that amount of time, because otherwise you get stuck in this really awful reinforcing loop of that avoidance.
I know that the LEA that I work with has an attendance plan, and they assign specific adults to 5 to 10 students, and they have to check in with a student every week to increase their sense of belonging in the school, provide them a safe space, but also provide them reasons to want to come to school, so then they could meet with that person.
And the other thing here too is that idea of like these kids, they're not fragile, they to believe in them and to not accommodate the anxiety. There's actually an evidence-based treatment for anxiety in kids that works really nicely for school avoidance and for OCD and other anxiety disorders, called SPACE. It's a parent group, and so it's treatment for the parents that and it works to improve the anxiety in the child, because the parents are learning how to respond to their kids' anxiety and not accommodate it. And that can be really useful.
Thank you for so much for that. It really does reiterate what we've been trying to do, and it is quite a struggle. Very reinforcing for the youth and the parents, and they find themselves in a position. I'm thankful for that information where they just don't want the battle with the child, and it's been tough. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Anything else? Maybe we can take one more question and then I can go to the closeout slides. Okay. Hold on. Hold on. Sorry. Technical difficulties. Okay. All the way back to the beginning. Okay. We have some resources here for, again, managing depression and anxiety in schools. These are some helpful websites. That space training that I mentioned is here too. I want to thank everyone here again for joining us, and again to reiterate that there will be a follow-up email after the end of the session with a certificate of completion. You'll have access to the slides that we presented and to the recording of the session. Your feedback is important to us. We need to hear what you think about this session, and in order to keep bringing you these resources that are free. It's really important to get your feedback. So your completion of the survey is a very important part of our quality control and to our future funding for this project. It allows us to continue to provide you with resources and training at no cost. In addition, it allows us to continually improve our services and provide the information and resources you are needing in the field. If you could please take a few minutes to let us know your thoughts, it would be greatly appreciated. You have 3 ways to access the survey. The link will be put into the chat box here. It will automatically pop up in your browser when the webinar ends, and it will also be provided in the follow-up email that we send after the session. So please fill that out. Stay connected to NTAC. You can access our website here, and I put it in the chat earlier as well, to see what kind of upcoming events, recordings. You can request individual support and technical assistance, and sign up for our newsletter. We're also on social media, so you can follow us there too. Here is our contact information, our flyer, and again, our website, so feel free to reach out. It is SAMHSA's mission to reduce the impact of substance abuse and mental illness in America's communities. So thank you so much for being here today. It was a pleasure having everyone. And hopefully we'll see some of you next week.
Thank you guys. See you later. Have a great day.